The first sound was not an explosion. It was the sound of air itself being crushed. Generaloberst Karl Heinrich von Truenfeld had spent the morning staring at maps that no longer mattered. The concrete bunker outside St. Lo smelled of damp stone, stale tobacco, and the quiet fear of men who knew they were running out of time. The Western Front had become a series of shrinking red arrows and hopeful blue lines, and every report that reached his desk felt thinner than the last, as if the war itself were being slowly starved. At 10:58 a.m., the bunker trembled just slightly. Dust sifted down from the ceiling like flour shaken from a baker's hand. An aide looked up, then back down, pretending not to notice. Von Truenfeld checked his watch, a habit drilled into him over decades of soldiering. He had learned early that discipline was often nothing more than refusing to show fear. Then the horizon changed. The observation slit faced west, toward the fields and hedgerows where his divisions had dug in. For weeks they had been fortifying every inch of ground, turning farms into strong points and villages into traps. He had ordered concrete poured until there was no more cement, wire strung until fingers bled, guns hidden in orchards and churchyards. It was not elegant, but it was solid. It was German. What he saw now was neither solid nor German. The sky darkened in layers, like a storm built of metal instead of clouds. At first, the shapes were too distant to count, just shimmering specks catching the sun, but they multiplied, stacking on top of one another, until the blue disappeared entirely. The air vibrated, not with thunder, but with a sustained mechanical roar that pressed against the ears and chest alike. Mein Gott, someone whispered. Von Truenfeld stepped closer to the slit. He had seen air power before. Poland, France, even Russia, where the Luftwaffe had once ruled the skies with cruel confidence. But this was different. This was not an attack. This was a presence. The radio crackled behind him, frantic voices overlapping, units reporting aircraft in every direction. Bombers, fighters, more bombers. The numbers made no sense. Someone said thousands. Someone else said more. An intelligence officer tried to form a sentence and failed. Outside, the first bombs fell. They did not fall one by one. They arrived together as if the sky itself had decided to collapse. In the span of 3 heartbeats, the ground erupted in a continuous wall of fire and earth. 13,000 aircraft released their payloads in a coordinated wave, so precise it felt unreal, as though time itself had been briefly compressed. 3 seconds, that was all it took. The defenses that had taken months to build were erased in a moment so short it could not even be fully understood. Trenches vanished, gun pits ceased to exist. Entire companies were swallowed before a single man could raise his head. The bunker shook violently. Lights went out. Men were thrown to the floor. The sound was beyond description, beyond volume. It was not loud. It was absolute, a pressure that flattened thought and memory alike. Von Truenfeld found himself on his knees, one hand braced against the concrete, the other gripping his watch so tightly the metal bit into his skin. He was aware, distantly, of screaming. He was also aware that some of it might be his own. When the first wave passed, there was a moment of unnatural silence, as if the world had taken a breath. Then the second wave came. Bombs walked forward across the landscape in perfect mathematical patterns. Fields lifted and turned inside out, trees snapped like matchsticks and vanished in geysers of dirt. The hedgerows that had once been the backbone of his defense simply ceased to be. A runner burst into the bunker, his helmet gone, his face streaked with blood and dust. He tried to speak, failed, tried again. There is nothing left. He said finally, the line, "It's gone." Von Truenfeld rose slowly, every joint aching. He moved back to the observation slit. ignoring the debris and the shouted warnings. Outside, the world had become something else entirely. The ground was no longer green or brown. It was gray and black, churning like the surface of the sea in a storm. Smoke rose in columns so thick they blocked the sun, and through them still the bombers droned on, endless and indifferent. He tried to imagine what it must look like from above, the American pilots sitting in warm cockpits, surrounded by instruments and oxygen masks, watching their bombs fall with clinical detachment. He wondered if they understood what they were doing, if they could comprehend the scale of destruction beneath them. Then he realized it did not matter. For years, German doctrine had preached defense in depth, elastic response, calculated withdrawal. But there was nothing elastic about this. You could not bend against the sky. You could not counterattack the horizon. A staff officer approached, pale and shaking. Herr General, communications with the 352nd Division are lost, and the 91st and the artillery groups to the south. We are attempting. Von Truenfeld raised a hand. He did not need to hear the rest. He had been a young officer in the last war, marching through mud and wire, watching men die a few yards at a time. He had believed then that war was decided by courage, by endurance, by the willingness to suffer more than the enemy. Later, he had believed it was decided by speed, by maneuver, by the brilliance of armored thrusts and daring commanders. Standing in that bunker, listening to the sky tear his army apart, he understood something new. War was now decided by industry. The bombing continued for what felt like an eternity, though his watch told him it was minutes. Precision gave way to saturation, and saturation to annihilation. Even the bunker, built to withstand artillery, groaned under the strain. When it finally ended, the silence was not peaceful. It was stunned. Von Truenfeld emerged into a landscape he barely recognized. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the smell of explosives burned his throat. Where roads had been, there were craters. Where villages had stood, there were only outlines, like ghosts etched into the ground. Bodies lay everywhere, some still, some moving weakly. Equipment was scattered and broken. Tanks flipped on their sides like toys. He saw a gun crew that no longer had a gun, men staring at empty hands as if something had been stolen from them personally. An officer saluted him automatically, then seemed to realize the gesture was absurd and let his hand fall. "What orders, Herr General?" the man asked. Von Truenfeld opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no orders that would change anything. He could tell them to hold, but there was nothing left to hold with. He could tell them to counterattack, but against whom? The sky. In the distance, he heard a new sound. Engines again, but different. Higher, pitched, fighters. He knew what would come next. The bombers had done their work. Now the ground forces would move, advancing behind a wall of destruction that no human defense could survive intact. He felt, for the first time in his long career, truly obsolete. As the first American artillery shells began to fall, he turned to his staff. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost gentle. "Do what you can," he said. "Save who you can." They looked at him, waiting for more. There was no more. Later, long after the front had collapsed and the retreat had become a rout, von Truenfeld would sit in captivity and try to explain what he had witnessed. Interrogators would ask him about numbers, about units, about tactics. He would answer as best he could, but he knew they did not really understand. How could they, how could anyone who had not stood there, who had not watched an entire defensive system vanish in 3 seconds, grasp the meaning of it? He would tell them about the sound, about the way the sky had seemed to lower itself onto the earth. He would tell them that it was not fear he felt, but clarity. The war was lost not in that moment, but the illusion that it could still be won was. Years later, when the fields around St. Low had grown green again when tourists walked quietly through cemeteries and children played where craters had once been. The sky would seem harmless. Blue, empty, but for Karl Heinrich von Trunfeld it would never truly clear. Because he had seen the future of war arrive all at once, in a roar of engines and fire, and he knew that no wall, no gun, no bravery could ever stand against 13,000 planes falling out of the sky together.